Hi, in this lesson we are going to link the descriptor layout that we defined in the last lesson with the memory buffer from the same lesson. We start by writing out two functions, one called createDescriptorPool and createDescriptorSet. I copy out both of these functions and I navigate to the initializeVulkan method. Here I call both of them as the last thing, then I screw up a bit in the buffer region where I will paste the method signatures and create their bodies. Now to create a descriptor pool and a descriptor set, we need to create member fields for both of these objects and initialize them to noHandle by default. Now we can go into the implementation of those methods. First, we will need to describe pool size. And the pool size would be of the type uniform buffer with the size for one descriptor count. After that, we can create the descriptor pool. We do that by initializing our pool createInfo. And we set the S-type to the current value. The pool size count is 1, and the pool sizes is the address of our pool size. We set the max sets to 1. Next we can call createDescriptorPool. Pass in the logical device, createInfo address, noAllocator, and the address to our descriptor pool field. If this wasn't successful, we exit the application. After that, we can allocate our descriptor set. We make a new descriptor set allocateInfo. We set the S-type. We set the descriptor pool to the descriptor pool field. The set count that we are allocating will be 1, and the descriptor set layout is the same layout we created in the last video. With this info, we can now call vk allocate descriptor sets. We pass in the logical device, address to the set info, and address to the descriptor set field. If it wasn't a success, we can exit now. Now that we are finished with the creation, I will quickly go into the destructor. In the destructor, we need to call destroy on the descriptor pool. And after this little detour, I will go back to the function where we created the descriptor set. In this function, we've already specified the layout that this descriptor set uses. Now we need to link the buffer. I make a new descriptor buffer info. We can set the buffer to the uniform buffer handles buffer, the offset to 0, and the range will be the size of the uniform transformation struct. We need to create a new vkwrite descriptor set object, where we set the S-type. We also set the destination set to the newly created descriptor set. The destination binding will be 0. The destination array element will also be 0. The descriptor type is an uniform buffer. Descriptor count is 1. And the buffer info is the info we created just a few lines ago. The next thing that we need to do is call the vkUpdate descriptor sets. We pass in the logical device, the count of the descriptor sets we're updating, the address to the right information, and 0 and no for the descriptor copy values. Now, when we render our index buffer, we also want to bind these descriptor sets. We want to bind them to the shader uniform value that we wrote. So in here, we call the command bind descriptor sets. We pass in the command buffer, the bind point, which is graphics, the pipeline layout, the first set index, and the count of the sets we're binding. The others two are descriptor set, and finally 0 and no for dynamic descriptor set values. I will copy the same function for the render buffer as well. This is all we need to render the triangle again. We can now build and run the project. And you can see this triangle rendered through the perspective of a camera. We can take a look at the previous video to see the differences. But in general, the triangle is now smaller because it is observed at a distance. It also has some perspective to it. I'll close this and let's make some modification to the view. Here in the main file, I will further add some X translation of the view to the left. And so if we build and run the project again, you'll see that the triangle has moved to the left. It is like the viewer has moved a step to the right from the triangle. I will now return this triangle to be in the center region again. So this is it about uniform values and descriptor sets. Overall, these two videos, we saw how to create shader code that uses uniform values, create a buffer and map it to the memory where we will create uniform values, create a descriptor set layout in the graphics pipeline that will be a bind point for the shaders, and finally create the descriptor set, which is the glue between the graphics pipeline and the memory that we write to.